Welcome everyone to the Healing Connections podcast. I'm your host, Emmy Vadnais, and today we are talking about yoga for healing neurological conditions with Dr. Arlene Schmid, who has been an occupational therapist for over 20 years and started to use yoga with her clients in the late 1990s. She pursued her PhD in Rehabilitation Sciences from the University of Florida with the intention of studying the benefits of yoga for people with disabilities. For over a decade, Arlene has developed and tested yoga interventions for research participants with a variety of illnesses and disabilities, including but not limited to stroke, traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, neuropathy, and Parkinson's disease. Welcome, Arlene. We're so happy to have you here today.
Hello. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So we are both occupational therapists, and I've noticed that you've been putting out a lot of great research on how to use yoga as therapy. And I was curious and I can't wait to hear more about your fabulous research studies. Could you share how you got interested in yoga or using yoga as therapy?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So like you said, I started using yoga with clients back in the late 1990s. I'm from Buffalo, New York originally, and that's where I did my OT degree, and there really was not a whole lot of yoga happening in Buffalo 20 years ago. But I actually moved to Hawaii right after I graduated from OT school, and Hawaii kind of has yoga and things like Tai Chi and other aspects of integrative medicine. It's much more influential there, and it's more integrated into healthcare, and it's not seen as a last option. It can be seen as a first option for folks, even 20 years ago. And so I personally started doing yoga, and I think this is how a lot of therapists get into this. I started using yoga personally and felt like it changed so much of my mindset and my body, and it helped me so much. I started using yoga with different clients, and I worked in a skilled nursing facility, and then I worked in a locked adolescent psych unit, and then I ended up in a hand therapy clinic, and really kind of saw this trend of yoga being helpful for all of these different folks and all of these different settings and populations, and really made a decision when I was in the hand therapy clinic that, I kept seeing people with carpal tunnel surgery over and over and over, and it wasn't carpal tunnel, right? It was like up here in the neck or the shoulders or the arms, and some stretching and some yoga probably would have been helpful rather than first going to surgery. And so I really made the decision that I wanted to research yoga and how yoga could be better than surgery or better than some other options. And, quite sadly decided I had to leave Hawaii to be able to do that. And then I went to University of Florida to do my PhD in Rehabilitation Sciences, where I will say people thought it was kind of crazy and ridiculous to go and do yoga research. It's back in, early 2000s. And so I did not get to do that as part of my doctoral work, but I've been working on it ever since I graduated, with some really great mentoring and influences from a lot of people. But it really was being, the time in the clinic is what really made me decide that this was what I wanted to do.
Wonderful. And so clearly you saw people improve with yoga, I would imagine, for you to go ahead and really, because that was the impetus for you getting your doctorate, right?
Yes, I did, over and over. And, whether it was someone with a stroke from 20 years ago or, an adolescent who had seen so much trauma and had, just so much going on in their life, but not having any coping skills or able to manage stress, to then hand therapy. So I just saw it over and over again, being something really powerful for people and being something that I, as a therapist, could work on them with, but more importantly, it was a tool they could take home and do it on their own. And it feels like people are way more interested in doing yoga on their own than a more traditional home exercise program. And they just were more likely to follow it and progress and make some nice changes for themselves.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for taking the lead in that. Certainly in occupational therapy and probably in the rehab or even healthcare, you're probably one of the people I know who's done the most research at this point. And so we really appreciate all that you've done. We'll talk a little bit more about your studies in just a moment. And I am an occupational therapist who also practices yoga. Many people think of yoga as the physical postures or the asanas, and there's a lot more to it, which you do share in your book here, Yoga Therapy for Stroke, which is a beautiful book. And anybody who's who knows anybody who's had a stroke, or any practitioners, healthcare, whether you're a rehab practitioner or even a physician, a medical doctor, a nurse practitioner. There's this really beautiful book that has not only how to do the physical postures, but even the true 8 limbs of yoga. And myself, having been practicing yoga personally for a number of years, I see how much it can benefit all of us. And so what did you see? What have you seen that you would like to share with all of us about how yoga can benefit people with neurological conditions, or clearly you've also mentioned some other conditions, because we know that yoga can help so many things.
Yeah, I mean, it gets so complicated, right? Because we don't really know why yoga works, right? And that's why we need to do the science and build the evidence for it. I really started off doing research in people with chronic stroke. And so, people who've had a stroke 20 some years ago, or, at least a year or so ago. And we saw changes for people. That part of that is because of neuroplasticity, right? We know the brain can change. But I really think part of it is because of the yoga. And so some of the changes we saw that aren't necessarily, we didn't measure it, right? Because some things are not that measurable. But we heard people talking about their vision really changing, or their aphasia being really something that really restricted them. And now they were able to get some words out and understand things better and just be clearer. And then the really, the simpler things to measure are things like balance and strength and range of motion. And we consistently see change in those outcomes really with every single population. Things like pain, fatigue, we really see improvements time and again. And for some folks, we also see change in things like something called emotional regulation. So our folks with stroke would talk about that they don't cry all the time anymore. Or one woman, I remember talking about her husband who had the stroke. She said, I really feel like I got my husband back because of this. One man talked about being able to climb his stairs and sleep in his own bed with his wife for the first time since his stroke. So many of those things are not measurable necessarily in a scientific research study, but as an occupational therapist, I feel like we're helping change people's lives and getting back to activity, participation, occupation. One person talked about being able to walk to the bus stop and get onto the bus, and it changed his life because it opened up his entire community for him. So yoga for these folks was so much more than simply increasing strength or balance, or even decreasing stress, right? For folks with some pretty severe disabilities, it really opened up their lives and changed their lifestyle so that they could be more of the person that they wanted to be and who they were before.
Those are great examples. I know you probably have hundreds of thousands of those, I would imagine.
I do have way too many, yes, and they all pop up in my head.
Yeah, those are great examples. I just want to share. So when I first started studying yoga, I went to a PKS Iyengar studio. And I just want to mention, so when I first started studying this a little over 10 years ago, there weren't actually many even books that showed pictures of how to do the asanas, believe it or not. And this book is, are you familiar with this book?
I am.
Yeah, it really does a nice job because it has pictures of different asanas in it, and how you can adapt the poses. And I just want to share that with people because I found this a great resource for being able to practice on my own at home as well, because it also uses the props. And BKS Iyengar, you probably know more about the history of this than I do, so please add in wherever you would like, is that he was ill when he was younger and he used yoga to heal himself. And he actually, I believe, was the first yogi that we know of who started using props and blankets and bolsters and straps so that anybody of all different physical abilities were able to do yoga. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, I think that's true. And I would say, do so much adapting and modifications that sometimes someone might walk in and say, that's not yoga. But I feel like it's truly yoga. It's just very adapted. And yoga is perfect for an OT, right? Because we're adapting the activity versus trying to change the person and their abilities. And so I think that's a great example of that, that he really healed himself through yoga, but was okay with changing the postures and what the postures look like.
Yes, yes. So you now teach at Colorado State University, is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And are you teaching so you teach in the occupational therapy program. Are you able to teach any specific courses or coursework on yoga or any other integrative health approaches?
So yes, that's a great question. I teach the adolescent and young adult occupations course because I worked in the adolescent psych unit quite a while ago. And so there's not a lot of room for information about integrative health, but they sure do hear it from me. And so they hear it. We do one whole lecture and lab on it so that they really kind of know why it's integrative health and why we don't wait till the last for yoga to be the last resort. They learn about different aspects of integrative health and kind of what they can do as a new graduate OT versus what they might need some more training for, and then just kind of why we might do some of these things versus other things. But I will say I kind of sprinkle it throughout the course as well, because they're also learning about brain injury and some other things where we've done other research. And so, yes, they do have to read my articles about yoga and brain injury, or yoga and something else that still fits that population. Eating disorders is a great option too. I haven't done that work, but there's a lot of research on yoga or other aspects of integrative health for eating disorders, specifically bulimia, and how much mindfulness can help with bulimia. So they definitely hear it from me
Yeah.
more than they would otherwise, I suspect. Yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is that folks like you who are teaching the newer generation of occupational therapists have so much to share of your coursework, that to share these newer approaches that used to be called complementary alternative medicine, right? And so now, like, we had the National Center for Complementary Alternative Medicine, and since there's so much efficacy from people like yourself doing great research to show the benefits, it's now called the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. And it's really, I would say, probably one of the fastest growing areas I can see in healthcare right now, that is, even though it's called these different names, holistic health, integrative medicine, complementary therapies, I really think that it's, you're helping to have it be something that's just practiced as part of healthcare. So thank you for being able to sprinkle that throughout your coursework. So can you share, or what would you like to share about, I think you have, is it about a dozen studies? And I know we don't have time to speak about all of them, but is there anything you would like to share, or something that surprised you from your research on yoga and how it can help with recovery from neurological conditions?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me, so kind of two things. One, and I think it's really important for us as OTs and therapists and healthcare clinicians, that really anyone can do some aspect of yoga. And I say that because after we finished our stroke study, and we had people, had their stroke 10 years ago, 20 years ago, one of the things we kept hearing from them is, I wish I would have had this right after my stroke. I feel like it would have made me better. It would have helped my recovery. And we went into 2 different acute rehab centers and offered yoga as part of inpatient rehabilitation. And we really offered it to anybody. It wasn't a strict research study that it was only people with stroke or brain injury. So it was brain injury, stroke, locked-in syndrome, spinal cord injury, traumatic accidents from cars, things like that. But the big takeaway for me was everyone could do it, everyone could benefit, and people could really generalize it to life outside of the yoga session. And so what I mean by that is, people in acute rehab are going through a lot. They're going through mourning, they're going through a lot of pain, they're really worried about finances and what's going to happen to their kids or what's going to happen to them. And so they were really able to take some of the breathing and stress reduction aspects of yoga, take it with them when they had to get that next fMRI or the MRI or the next CAT scan that they were really scared of the actual machine, or they were really scared of the results of that. And so we didn't even talk about them using it in other places, but they figured out that they could make therapy easier because they could focus on their breathing. We had a couple people with locked-in syndrome or really high spinal cord injuries, and they could breathe. And so we're right now even looking at yoga in the ICU and the burn ICU. And for folks there, they have literally no control over anything in their life, but now they can control their breath. And that is really powerful for some of our folks. And it gives them power, it gives them control, and it allows them to use that breath in other places. And so that's the one takeaway, is that pretty much as long as people can breathe on their own, we can deliver yoga and they can get something out of it. And then the second is really this idea that people can see significant improvements for real 20 years later, 25 years later. And yes, that's because of neuroplasticity, but I don't think that we see those same changes in pure exercise studies. And so I do think there's something to yoga being more powerful, and that yoga is really allowing for people to recover more. And this is my own kind of soapbox, but what I think happens for lots of folks, right? The car accident, the brain injury, the stroke, they spend all this time thinking about, well, if I didn't do this, if I didn't get into the car, if I didn't eat all the French fries, this would not have happened. And they spend a lot of time thinking about their future. What's going to happen? Will I walk again? Will I be able to work again? Will I pick up my kids again? And they're really not in the present moment. And so what I've decided after all this research is yoga helps people be in the present. We know that about yoga. But I truly think it helps people recover more. I think it allows for them to get to their full, maybe fuller potential of the rehabilitation process, versus being so worried about the past or the future and not really engaging fully with where they are. And so I think those are kind of the two important things that for me to be able to tell people, I've seen this and I know you had your stroke 20 years ago, but there is a potential for improvement after all of this time. Improvement being even movement, feeling, sensation, change with aphasia, change with reading. So some pretty significant changes 20 years later, I think are my two big surprises and my big takeaways.
I love that. I mean, I remember, so I've been an OT a little bit over 20 years myself. And I remember in school that we were taught, I don't know, it's apparently changing now in certain schools anyway, that you see the most recovery usually in the first 6 months to a year was, I believe, what we were taught. So it's really refreshing to hear that there is hope and options for people who have maybe been told that they maybe have possibly reached their maximum potential of independence or strength or flexibility, range of motion, and that there are possibilities for healing.
Yeah, I was, so we're about the same time since graduation, and I was absolutely taught that you've got about 6 months, and that's that. And so I think it is really powerful to tell people and their families, their caregivers, that they can still make improvements, they can still see change. I think that's huge for people. I mean, they have to put the work in, right? But it's possible.
Yeah. And something else that you highlighted that I think is worth sort of repeating here is sounds like you're saying that yoga, and I believe there are studies that have been coming out to show this, and I've certainly noticed this in my life practicing yoga and the people I've worked with, that it can help with healing trauma or adjusting to, quote, what some people refer to as a new normal. And in fact, I highlighted on page 46 that you mentioned that people can become so attached to who they once were that they might have a hard time becoming who they were meant to be. And I think that's a really profound statement. Can you share more about that?
Yes, I think, that comes from seeing lots of folks go through this, whether it was stroke or brain injury or some other illness. But I think people get really attached. And part of yogic philosophy is to try not to be attached to things. But part of what we could be attached to is who we were. And so that is part of yoga. But I think it should also be part of therapy and occupational therapy, that we're kind of more than who we used to be and who we will be in the future. But I do think that people get really stuck on the idea of what they were, or we see it also with younger folks who have spinal cord injuries or brain injuries, and they're big athletes and they get hurt. I'm in Colorado, so we see a lot of ski accidents, and we have folks come in and they're not going to be that same person again after the spinal cord injury. And you see some people can be so resilient, and you see other people be really attached to who they were and what they could do. And so I think yoga can help for all sorts of different diagnostic populations.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, an opportunity for us to honor the grief, right, of our clients, and to recognize that that is a real process. And at one hand, some people are going to, have different abilities going forward, but also it sounds like it can also help people recover more fully in a lot of cases than maybe they would have otherwise, and that we knew of before.
Yes, I agree. And you are right. We really have to give space for people to deal with their loss and for dealing with the mourning of what they cannot do anymore. But if they get stuck there, I think that they can't get to their full recovery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before we go on, I realize there's different definitions of yoga, and I'm curious if you could share what you feel. I know it's a big topic to try to wrap up in a sentence, but if you could share for maybe somebody who's listening who's not that familiar with yoga, what yoga is.
Oh, that's such a good question, really, because we do kind of couch it like this idea of yoga and think everyone's on the same page. So, I think a lot of people think of a 22-year-old standing on their head in a little tiny Lululemon outfit, right? And so I really want us to advocate that yoga is so much more than that. And again, that everyone can do yoga. And so in the West, yoga is different than in India, where yoga was really developed, but there are actually 8 limbs of yoga, and we won't get into all of that. But I think here in the West, we traditionally focus on more of 3 of the limbs, which are the physical postures of yoga, the breath work, and some of the meditation. I would say in our research studies, we do try to integrate 2 of the other limbs, which are the yamas and the niyamas, which are kind of pathways of how to live, which is some of those places where we get into not being attached to things. So Hatha yoga is kind of thought of as the foundation of yoga in the West. And so when we talk about yoga, we're more traditionally talking about Hatha yoga, which includes these yoga postures, but we try to have we're working with folks who have a lot of pretty severe physical disability. And so our postures look pretty different maybe than other people's because they're modified, but it's really the idea of getting into a posture and kind of holding it. And we think part of why yoga is really effective is because it's, if you think of physiologically speaking, it's stretching and strengthening the muscle at the same time. And so that's why we see some really powerful physical improvements in things like strength, range of motion, balance, flexibility. But it can look really different for different people, right? There's different styles. But that is more traditionally what most of the research on yoga that's coming out in the States is more of this kind of Hatha yoga, maybe Vini yoga, but it's really this moving into a posture, moving in and out of a posture, but really working on strength and stretching at the same time, and always pairing it with breath. And so that's what really makes it yoga versus just exercise. So we know yoga is more powerful or more effective than resistance exercise in a straight plane of movement, if you think of bicep curls or something like that. So we know yoga is more effective, and it's probably because it's more dynamic. It has, it's not the straight plane of movement, but really we think it's because it's pairing breath to movement. And so the person has to work on remembering to breathe and not holding their breath, but moving and breathing with each movement and really kind of connecting themselves. So we think that's kind of where the magic is. And that's essentially what yoga looks like in our studies and most studies that are happening here in the States.
Wow, great description and summary. It really makes me think that how yoga, and this is one of the reasons I love practicing it personally, and sharing about it, is that it truly is a mind, body, spirit practice, and that all parts of us can be utilized depending on the intention of the practitioner. Would you say that seems accurate as well?
Yes, I do. And I think that's probably why a lot of occupational therapists are picking yoga up as part of treatment interventions, because we say we are holistic, and yoga is really holistic because it does treat the mind, body, and spirit all at the same time. So yes, I agree. Absolutely.
And do you have, can you share a little bit about how, well, a couple things I want to touch on: breath work and meditation, but they really go hand in hand. If you could share however you would like to discuss what sometimes seems like two separate things, but really are the same, how that can benefit somebody for recovery of a neurological condition.
Yes. I will say our folks have trouble with the meditation component, right? Because a lot of times the meditation is kind of at the end and we're in Shavasana or corpse pose when we're laying on the floor. A lot of people fall asleep. So that's not quite as meditative, but it is relaxing for them. The big place that we've really, for our studies, where we've really focused on breath work is at the beginning of the session, and we do alternate nostril breath work. So that is closing off one side of the nose, breathing up, holding it, closing off the other, and breathing out through the other side. We think that that helps change blood flow to both sides of the brain. The corpus callosum, of course, attaches both hemispheres, and so there's some new data coming out that there's actual change in the white matter of the corpus callosum and with meditation. And so that's kind of why we make sure we always do that. We don't know that. There hasn't been fMRI data to support that. And so we really start there. And I would say that's another place where it doesn't necessarily look like it looks in the books, right? Because someone with a stroke can't necessarily get their fingers into the right positions, but we don't really care about that as much as breathing in one side, breathing out the other, and back up and around. Meditation, we have, because of folks who are working with, a lot of them have some cognitive impairment. A lot of our meditation has really focused on relaxation and starting like with a full body relaxation. So starting on the toes and working their way up. And so that's kind of relaxation, but it's also helping them be in the moment and helping them kind of like the beginning components of meditation, where we're trying to teach some self-compassion, trying to teach some patience, but I would say it's a pretty slow process to get to full, where we would say they're meditating. We are not. There are other people out there doing full meditation studies, and so we are not doing that. We just include meditation as a component of the yoga interventions.
Yeah, and I think that at least my personal experience, now I was trained formally in meditation before I started my yoga asana training. And part of my yoga training was actually, what I was going to say is that when you do the physical postures, the asanas, that the meditation can come, especially if you're practicing it how you're describing it, which is what I love about Iyengar yoga, is holding the poses, because then you really are connecting and really having an opportunity to feel into all parts of your body and really being present in that way. My teacher would invite us, we'd actually meditate for 5 minutes before the asanas, and then I was invited to sit and to meditate with him for a full 30 minutes after, which was really lovely. And he would say, you know, depending on people's religion or their ideas of God, but just thinking of God as sort of a peaceful state, or, you know, if your belief is it's an actual deity or the only God, he would say we do the asanas so that we can then sit and commune with God. And for me, that really resonated with me in that peaceful state that would come from doing the asanas. My mind would get more calm, and then I was able to actually meditate better. So,
yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And we really think of Shavasana or corpse pose when they're laying on the ground as the time that everything becomes integrated. And so it gives their body that time to shift into just allowing their practice to be kind of become one within their body, and give them time for that and give them space for that. You know, otherwise they pop up and they're out the door. And so I feel like they really need that time. And for some of them, they're meditating, and for some of them, like I said, they're sleeping. Either way.
Yeah, well, they're clearly relaxed, which has a lot of research itself, the relaxation response. And maybe they have insomnia. Maybe it's actually helping them to come into that more, their nervous system aligning more. Is that something you're looking at as well as the the relaxation component or yoga overall in your studies?
So we haven't, well, which part? Sorry, are you talking about sleep specifically or the nervous?
You have a researcher's mind. I just meant, do you look at the relaxation response as part of the yoga and how you're studying it, or do you look at it overall as the different, the 8 limbs, or what you're suggesting to your clients?
Yeah, so we, I will say we don't really talk about the 8 limbs. We try to keep it simple, which I think is true in lots of yoga, right? And then we don't, so there are some people out there who are measuring different aspects of the response. So they might do like a cortisol swab to see if anxiety changes. As an occupational therapist, I'm much more interested in seeing improvement or change in occupational performance or occupational participation. So that tends to be more where I care, right? So I care about the guy who can get on the bus and it changes his quality of life. And I'm really glad someone else cares about the relaxation response and the anxiety. I just don't personally do that kind of research. And part of that, to be honest, is simply money.
Yeah.
And how much everything costs. So one thing I would love to be able to do is functional imaging of the brain. So we know there's some really great work coming up by Sarah Lazar, and she is looking at meditators and functional imaging of meditators. And they actually know as meditators, they are increasing their gray matter and also increasing the connectivity within the brain, which is amazing to be able to tell someone you can grow your brain, right, with this, especially for people with stroke and brain injury who have lost parts of their brain. And so we can increase connectivity. That's huge for them. But we don't know that necessarily in yoga yet. Part of that is the expense that comes with imaging. Part of it is you have to be able to do the pose or do something in the machine to be able to elicit the response. So meditators can lay there and meditate, but yoga, we can't necessarily do that as easily. And we don't, like some people are just doing, like plantar flexion of the ankle, and I mean, that's not yoga, right? And that's, as an occupational therapist, that's not that meaningful to me. It's important, right, if we see change, but that's just not where my primary interests lay.
Yeah, so I suppose maybe you've already done this, but maybe studying after they've done the yoga intervention and they're in Shavasana in the fMRI machine, resting in Shavasana.
I mean, I would love to. Colorado State does not have this yet, so they're just getting it.
Awesome.
fMRI, but we'll have to share it with the horses and the dogs, actually, because it's a vet school. And so they're still working it all out.
Hey, we're animals. We just think
I know. So one of these days, that is part of my, my hope and my plan, but one of these days.
Yeah. Oh, I love the functional component. I think it's fascinating to hear how you do the research. I mentioned the relaxation response because I teach meditation in my practice and for continuing ed classes to healthcare professionals. And one of the things that I'm a big fan of is prevention and wellness. So, and I do know there's a lot of research specifically by Herbert Benson and others showing that by regularly inducing the relaxation response through meditation, it could be through gardening, it could be going for a walk, it could be taking a bath, that can actually help with prevention, which is huge because I've seen stats that upwards of 75% of chronic conditions can be prevented by lifestyle changes. And so is that something that you're a fan of, is showing also how yoga might be able to help with prevention and wellness? So we don't actually have to have people even recover, or as many people, I know accidents happen, but recover from neurological conditions in the first place.
Oh yeah. I mean, that would be lovely, right? If we have less strokes and less brain injuries. It is not where I have gone. And so simply one reason is because you would need such a large study and a really expensive study to be able to show that if we did this now, we won't have a stroke later. But I think, there's so much reason to pursue that work. And, part of the Affordable Care Act is prevention and wellness. And my other thought on it is that we know we can prevent the next stroke, right? So even someone who's had this stroke, we can prevent the next one. And so I don't think I will say people who have disabilities are less likely to have prevention and wellness research, but also prevention and wellness interventions at all. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to be able to look into that and kind of go that route. I don't know what I would look at as a researcher to be able to see prevention in the short term, right? To be able to
Right. It has to be a long study because you need to show people's lifestyle in order to show that what they did against other populations, that this actually seems to be the intervention that helped it. Well, and you're doing beautiful research. I actually have a close family member who I believe has a post-concussion syndrome. So has probably had several closed head injuries, and it's manifested actually as significant mental health issue. And now that we know that, particularly with like the national football and so forth, that more people have been having concussions than we realize, and there's more awareness of it. What have you seen that yoga can do to help with that population?
So personally, I actually had a concussion in the fall, and it was my first real concussion. But it was a doozy. I was out of work for quite a while, and I really struggled getting back to work. And I will say, I finally, once I wasn't nauseous and was able to walk around and everything, I ended up going to yoga, and it was so hard at first because it was a regular yoga class, right? So there's lots of up and downs and down dogs and all of that. But I would say within, I bet 2 or 3 sessions, I felt so much more like myself. And I was nauseous all the time, and I stopped being nauseous. And so I don't really know what the mechanism is, right? I don't know what was happening, unless it's just that yoga really helps us regulate. So we have done 2 studies now on people with brain injury, more severe brain injury, I would say. So one was someone who had polytrauma from war, someone who had been hit by a train, so some very severe brain injury. And then the other one was kind of a mix of different levels or severity of brain injury. And so we see those physical changes in balance and strength, but what we really hear from them is that they feel more like themselves, or their caregivers talk about, like, this is more my person who I'm used to. And that emotional regulation of not being so angry or so upset for, I don't want to say for no reason, but it's not, the reaction isn't lining up with the stimulus. But I think it's one thing for the caregivers to notice it and see it, but I think it's really important when the person with the brain injury or the concussion is able to kind of witness it and know it in themselves, that they can see those changes. We've been thinking about doing some work. So here at CSU, we have lots of sports and injuries that come with those sports. And so we've been kind of trying to figure out a way to maybe integrate yoga. So yoga's being integrated into sports, but more for things like flexibility and strength and keeping your mind in the game, but they haven't really been looking at it for helping with recovery from the concussion. So we've been kind of playing around with that idea. So
wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you can tell I am like an OT, right? Master of no, jack of all trades kind of thing. And so
we can go in so many different directions. That's probably why we chose to be OTs, because it's so holistic.
Yes, and we can do
individual.
Anything, right? And so we have really worked on yoga consistently, but it's really been in different populations over as yoga becomes more popular and people think, oh, I want to try yoga for this diagnostic population. And so we've been really successful since we're okay with kind of taking our intervention and moving it around a little bit.
Beautiful. If it's all right with you, I just want to take a moment and read from page 61 and 62 of your fabulous book that I hope everybody gets a copy of who's interested in how yoga can help with neurological conditions. Because would you say, Arlene, that even though your book and research, at least that's in this book, is on stroke, would you say that this could translate over to other neurological conditions? Probably, or are you not ready to say that just yet?
I think for some populations, so we're just we just finished up a Parkinson study. And so, that's different, right? Because they are progressive. And so we're still seeing improvement in balance, actually. which is great, right? Because otherwise they might show decline. But I do think there are different things I would do with different folks. So I wouldn't want to say we could generalize it. Probably more to brain injury, we could generalize that book and a lot of the concepts. I would just be thoughtful or wary of things like, you know, with an acute stroke, we don't want anyone to be in down dog and have their head below their heart. And as they become someone with a chronic stroke, they can do that. But I think being really knowing your population and knowing your person, I think is really important. There are some books that are being written by the same company, or not being written, but by the same company is putting them out for Parkinson's, for MS. So for some different populations, because they're different enough that I think we should just be giving everyone the exact same thing. And so
they affect a different part of the nervous system, right? So they have might have different symptoms, but so that makes sense.
And we're doing a chronic pain study right now, and some of it is very similar in the sense that we all start seated, then standing, and then we get to the floor. But the goals are different. It's just like OT, right? So the goals are different. So the intervention is yoga, but it has to be some different postures and different reasoning for those postures.
That makes sense. Well, thank you for clarifying.
Sure.
I just want to highlight a couple. So this, correct me if I'm wrong. So your folks had 16 sessions in total, 2 classes for 8 weeks. Was that their therapy, or was that after their individual therapy?
So we've run a few studies, but I will say we have done that dose pretty consistently. So twice a week for 8 weeks, so 16 sessions. But I think those are all folks with chronic stroke. And so they are done with everything.
So this is after they've done their rehab, they now have come to you to do specifically yoga therapy. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to highlight a couple of these changes that you've noted here. So cognitive changes, improved processing time, more concrete thinking and memory, improved ability to attend to conversation or tasks, better motor planning or ability to follow instructions, enhanced social, cognitive, and emotional intelligence. And there's more cognitive changes. So if you get the book, it's on page 61. Emotional changes, this is really profound for those of us who either been in this situation, either if you are somebody who suffered from a stroke or other neurological conditions, or if you are treating someone who has that. Emotionally, a person can feel less frustrated, feel less anxious, less depressed. And so that would probably translate over for those people who maybe are taking medications. Again, they would have to talk to their doctor, but they might be able to decrease, or maybe in certain cases eliminate, some of those types of mood stabilizers. So more stable mood, improved emotional regulation, less crying, which we know for those of us who work with people with stroke can happen, ability to be less reactive and have more appropriate responses to events, and feel like their old self. And then physically, which is I think what a lot of people think of initially, but now we know that it is truly, you know, the whole mind, body, spirit, can improve sensations, including decreased paralysis and enhanced proprioception of the affected area, improvements in motor control, less asymmetry, less fatigue, improved vision, like you had mentioned earlier, decreased pain, which is huge, right, for so many people. And there's a lot of studies on yoga for helping pain in general. Or I don't know if there's a lot of studies, I should say. There's more studies coming out, is probably the best way to say it. Improved balance, decreased fall risk, improved gait speed and endurance, increased flexibility, strength, and range of motion. So absolutely beautiful. I love also how you share the hand positions, they call mudras, which for people who've had a stroke, often there's one. Can you share a little bit about what you've done with the mudras and how you've seen it help people?
Sure. So essentially, right, it's yoga for your hands.
Oh, here's some pictures. Yeah, yes. Just a couple pictures. Yeah, yoga for your hands. Okay. Yeah.
It's yoga for your hands. And so one major reason that we do this, we often start with this, and we start with it in the first few weeks, is to kind of build confidence, right? So they can probably do this, at least with one hand. And with the other hand, it's great because we might have an assistant there who can kind of help them into the posture, but they can help themselves and open or close their fingers the way they're supposed to do the mudra. But it's also a great place for mental practice. And so we know folks with stroke, disability, whatever it is, spend a lot of time sitting around, or even during acute rehab time, they spend a lot of time waiting for the next thing. And so mudras are something that we think can really be good for folks because they can do the mental practice, they can see their hand doing it, versus if we talk about some other yoga postures, right, that it's like more like at the hips or something, they can't see it and feel it as much as they can see their hand doing something or not doing it. But it allows them to really use their other hand or just kind of be more independent with something. And so it's really partly meant to be a confidence booster in the sense that they can all do it. They can practice it at home. And then there's different mudras for different reasons. And I am not an expert in mudras by any chance or by any means, but you would do different things for different reasons. But our primary reason is to make them confident, help them trust us, because we are going to get to the floor in a few weeks. And for folks with stroke and brain injury, a lot of times the last time they were on the floor is they fell and they couldn't get off the floor. So a lot of it is truly building confidence in themselves, building confidence in our team and our research group, and then figuring out what mudras might make them feel better or not feel better.
Yeah, and then is that something that you encourage them that they could be, for example, if they're sitting in a waiting area or watching television, they could be practicing their mudras?
So what I would say is really cool about yoga is we actually don't encourage anything. We don't encourage home practice. We don't encourage breath work outside. They just start doing it. And so
that's awesome.
8-week interventions at about week 3 in pretty much every study, they come in and you can tell, right? They look different. They have better posture. And they can feel a difference. And so at about week 3 or week 4, in every study, they've asked us for what should they do at home. And so those are the examples we give them, right? Do it at home, do it watching TV, do it while you're waiting. One of the biggies we hear is when people are driving and they use their breath work to calm themselves down when they're in a stressful driving situation. But I think it's so great because as a therapist, people do not do your home exercise programs, right? But they do this on their own. They initiate it. And so we just kind of wait for that to show up. And then we say, oh, well, here you go. Like, here's some things you can do at home. But I would say it has happened in every study that we've run. And I think it's really just this nice thing that they feel independence in. It gives them control over something versus me, the therapist, telling them what to do. They just figure it out on their own.
Yeah, and compliance is a word that's talked about in healthcare, medical settings, and for those who are therapists, you certainly understand what it's like to try to get your clients to participate in their home exercise programs or whatever their functional skills programs might be to carry out at home, and that isn't always successful. And so it's nice to hear that people are initiating, asking that. And I found that for myself when I was taking yoga classes regularly, that after a while, I wanted to practice at home on my own because I knew how good it made me feel. And I wanted to feel that way more often. And that's really lovely to hear that. So one other thing that I've noticed with yoga is that some people have fear or concern. Can you speak a little bit to how those who might be concerned that it could be something that goes against their religion, if you've ever come up into a situation like that and how you've handled that?
Yes, it's a good question. It has definitely come up more since I've been a researcher than when I was a clinician. Although I was a clinician in Hawaii, right? And this was kind of all over the place. So we have definitely had people say they could not be part of our study, and very specifically say because yoga is devil worship. We've even had people drop out of our studies because they've gone home and Googled the word namaste and kind of found out that it's yoga and then it's Indian and Hindi. And so have dropped out of the studies because it is, they're worried that they are praying to another god or another religion. And so it's definitely out there. And there's definitely religions who for sure say, this is not for you. This is not what you should be doing. And so I personally don't try to get in the middle of all of that. But we we never are praying to a God. We're not meditating to a God. If people ask us, and they certainly have, we say, whoever your God is, or whoever you want to spend your time with, that's fine. And so that answer has been okay for most people, I feel like. And most people don't get caught up in this. It's more if they happen to read an article about it, or their pastor or priest has really specifically said this is a pathway to another religion. But while we're trying to follow the 8 limbs of yoga, we don't include anything about religion or other gods or other aspects of religion at all.
Yeah, great. I personally have not been instructed or of any books I've read about yoga that have taught me to worship any particular God. So I would very much agree with that. In my own experience, it's only enhanced my own personal spiritual beliefs and practices. And that's actually what has been taught to me by practitioners. Now, I was trained by a advanced Iyengar yoga teacher who had been studying it and practicing it for over 20 years. And so I really appreciate you addressing that, so that people who do want to give it a try, because it does have so many wonderful health benefits, and that it can be practiced alongside of your religion. And for those who don't have a spiritual faith, people who identify as atheist, then you don't have to, that's fine. You can just see how it helps you in your life with all these great research benefits that Arlene and others are doing. So, well, thank you for addressing that. One last question. Could you share, for those healthcare practitioners who are interested in, well, 2 questions. For those healthcare practitioners who would like to learn more about how to get trained in, what advice or recommendations would you give for how much training you think they would need before they could start bringing it into their practice? Because at this point, there isn't any standard that I know of in OT education, or really any healthcare profession, that says you have to have this many hours, unless you know otherwise. I'd love to hear that. And also for those who have a family member with neurological conditions, or a stroke or Parkinson's, what would you recommend as far as where they might be able to seek out these services, or how they could maybe ask their doctor or prescribing practitioner to help them get in touch with these great services to help them?
Yeah, so good question. So I would say it's becoming more normal for students in even med school and PT and OT school to at least be hearing about these options. And so, like we talked about before, it used to kind of be complementary and alternative medicine, with the idea that this was the last resort, this weird alternative thing. And now we are really going with the language of integrative health, as we're trying to integrate it into healthcare, integrate it into therapy. So there are no standards right now. At the most basic level, I think all of us as therapists or healthcare practitioners can go to a person and talk about breath work at the most, at the simplest sense, right? Letting them know they can control their breath, and that is powerful and strong for them. Knowing breath work can make you hot, can make you cold, can make you stressed, can make you more energetic, can make you sleepy. And so knowing that people need to kind of look into it and know what's up. But the sense that take a breath, just that simple, like let's take a breath, let's calm ourselves down. I think all of us can do that. We recently did a survey and surveyed about 200 therapists and healthcare practitioners around the world to kind of ask them, how are you integrating yoga into your practice, clinical practice, and what's your advice? And the number one thing that people came back and said was that they really need to have their own yoga practice.
Yes.
So they shouldn't just be thinking, oh, I'm just going to add this in because it's fun or it's interesting, but they really need to have their own yoga practice. And I really liked hearing that, right? Because that's really different than most of OT, or certainly, other fields where we kind of might do onto other people, but we don't, if we e-stim someone, we don't e-stim ourselves all the time, right? But having our own yoga practice was the most important thing. And then there is something so I did a yoga teacher training, and I don't teach yoga, but I learned so much about myself, and I learned about myself as a therapist and as a researcher. And so that's one option. And then there's people like you who are doing continuing education kinds of trainings and things like that. And so I think if you really want to go this route, it is your job to know what you're doing and do no harm. I think there's places we do have to be very careful in that. One of those places is eating disorders. One of those places is with people with trauma, that we could use the wrong words and really upset someone or set someone off, or, who knows, right? But we just have to be really thoughtful and careful about that. So there are no standards. I don't know that there are any coming out anytime soon, but I think taking it on your own and knowing what you're doing no harm, and being a holistic therapist for your clients. So really knowing the whole, you don't have to know all of the 5,000 years of yogic philosophy, right? But knowing kind of what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And for those who are seeking out these kinds of services, where would you recommend they go, or how do you feel like they could get in touch with somebody who is practicing the great benefits that you've researched?
Oh, yes. Sorry about that. So there are yoga therapists out there, right? And so there's the International Association of Yoga Therapists. And so they're a wealth of information. They publish a journal every year that is research about yoga and yoga therapy. And so I think that's a great option. And then you can also find out who's a yoga therapist in your community. So yoga therapists have quite extensive training to be a yoga therapist versus a yoga teacher. I will say then so I live in Fort Collins, Colorado. There's yoga everywhere. But what's happening is there's community-based yoga for people with disabilities. So we have specifically a Parkinson's group, an MS group, and someone now is starting a neurological group. And so I think kind of looking at the community level, because the trick is yoga is great, but people can't just go to a yoga class. With some level of disability, they can't just go to a yoga class. And so they really have to find something that's adapted and modified. So looking to find either a yoga therapist or an OTPT, someone who is a yoga teacher, but a therapist who can deliver in an adapted way, but also a safe way.
Right. Who really understands all aspects of rehabilitation.
Yeah.
And how to integrate that in with yoga. So
yeah.
Great. Well, we maybe have spoken a little longer than I initially anticipated. I could talk with you for hours.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Great. Thank you so much. Anything else you would like to share with those who may be listening about yoga for healing neurological conditions, or yoga in general?
Just that it seems to be so powerful for so many people. And I think it's worth giving it a try. Personally, also as a therapist, I think it probably makes us better therapists because we can deal with our own stress a little bit better, but I think it also keeps us in the moment. I think therapists are busy. And if you're always thinking of the next patient and the next thing you have to do, you're not in the moment, you're not being the best therapist. So I think, it's not just for our clients. I think it can be for us as well. And so that's one of the takeaways I try to get into my students' head, that it's a way for them to cope and have less burnout as well as for a therapist, but really being in the moment with your clients and being for that person versus the next 10 people you have to see.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Arlene Schmid. Is there any way that somebody can get in touch with you if they would like to get in contact with you or learn more about you or your work?
Sure. So you can contact me at my email address. So if you Google me, I'm easy to find. But it is arlene.schmid at Colo State, which is COLO state.edu. And I would say we are still doing that survey. So anyone who would like to fill out our survey for us, who's a therapist or any health clinician who uses yoga, we would love to get your information. So just send me an email and I'll send you out the link, or I can also chat about this all day long. So, I'm happy to chat. So
wonderful. Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Arlene Schmid, for joining us today here on the Healing Connections podcast. And do check out holisticot.org and emmyvadnais.com. Thank you, Arlene, and bye for now, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.